afternoon, everyone, and welcome to A Cup of Hope with Hope Against Trafficking and the Michigan Abolitionist Project. Today, you're going to have an opportunity to submit questions to our panel by typing your questions into the Facebook Live event on either Hope Against Trafficking or the Michigan Abolitionist Project's Facebook pages. Feel free to send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We'll collect these and address them at the end of the session. Also, feel free to add any comments and just let us know that you're here. We'd love to see you. Now, I'd like to go ahead and welcome today's panelists. We have Hannah McPeak, who's the Education Director for Hope Against Trafficking, and Emily Johnson, Program Coordinator at Michigan Abolitionist Project. Today's special guest on our topic of a guide to ethical shopping is Emily Smith. She is the owner of Adored Boutique. In 2016, she left her secure employment of 19 years and followed God's call to change her career. She walked away from the boat into his great unknown and started a business in a field she had no experience in. God broke her heart for the things that break his regarding the global human trafficking industry, and she decided she was going to become a part of the solution. Adored Boutique opened in December 2016 in Grand Rapids, Michigan. All of her artisan groups and vendors have gone through in-depth assessment and have provided documented verification of their manufacturing processes and environments. As a result of her intentional ethical purchasing, to date, Adored Boutique has paid an estimated 3,000 months of above living wage salaries for vulnerable artisans around the globe. Additionally, through her 15% profit give back, Adored has contributed over $25,000 towards human trafficking prevention, rescue, and restoration efforts in the United States. So welcome to Emily Smith, the owner of Adored Boutique and an abolitionist.
That's awesome, Emily. We are so grateful to have you. You're doing amazing.
I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah, I mean, I'm excited about this specific episode, you guys, because it's the time of year. We are full, throttle into the holiday season, and with Christmas coming up and with all the shopping, I know Black Friday shopping is starting to happen. I mean, I think, places are picking their own times and their own days that they can promote a Black Friday shopping. And I think Target's going all the whole month of November, all that stuff. But it's important because we want to talk about ethical shopping, and this is the time, right? This is the time to really do that. And we're just excited to have Emily S. with us to kind of guide us through the conversation.
Yes. So Emily S. actually, she reached out to MAP at some point and was just sharing information about her boutique as an ethical place to shop, and wanted to be included in our conversations of, in our resources, as a place for people to come shop and shop ethically.
Oh, Emily, can you hear us?
I can hear, but I think we lost her.
Okay. But to finish what she was saying, though, I know that that you, Emily S., was looking to get on the list of resources for ethical shopping on Michigan Abolitionist Project's website. Yeah. And that's how you guys made that connection. And then through that, we invited you to come and be a part of this episode to talk about it. And, some of the key pieces of needing to do ethical shopping is related to human trafficking as part of your story, Emily, as you talk about, being impacted by that issue and wanting to then make a difference. And because labor trafficking is such an issue today in our world. And I know globally right now, the International Labor Organization and the Walk Free Foundation, in partnership with IOM, estimate that there's 24.9 million people trapped in forced labor. Mm-hmm. And so in different industries and different aspects of labor trafficking or labor exploitation, I guess. And the U.S. Department of Labor has identified over 148 goods from 76 countries made by forced labor and child labor. And so that is such a problem, and it's really a bigger issue than we actually realize.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And so when we talk about labor trafficking or labor exploitation or forced labor, it's how would you say it's when somebody is being used in order to help somebody else create profit, right? And Emily, you popped on just in time. Welcome back. Can you hear us, Emily?
Yeah, sorry about that.
That's okay. Technology sometimes, is good, and sometimes it kind of messes you up a little bit, but that's okay. Emily, can you talk to us a little bit more about, I was just getting into labor trafficking and forced labor, and if you want to get into that a little bit, we would love to hear.
Yeah, is it cutting me in and out, or can you hear me okay?
I can hear you.
You're okay now.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so I'm just going to get into it. Labor trafficking is a form of modern-day slavery, as many of you know, in which individuals perform labor or services through the use of force, fraud, and coercion. Labor trafficking includes situations of debt bondage, forced labor, exploitive labor, which Emily S. will get into in a little bit, and also involuntary. So we have a demand for cheap goods and prices pressures suppliers, especially those at the top of the supply chain, who also want to make a large profit. So these suppliers seek to find the cheapest labor. So these supply and demand factors are reinforced then by systematic structural issues such as lack of access to education, inadequate employment opportunities for the educated, corruption, and social stratification. So we see supply and demand working out here in situations of labor trafficking, the demand for cheap goods, and pressuring suppliers to then find cheap labor. So that's how labor.
Darn.
Oh, you're almost finished with that. That's how labor trafficking works. And
yes.
So Emily asks, what is your response to that, and with regard to like sweatshops and the garment industry specifically?
Yeah. So when we hear about labor trafficking, a lot of times it's more cocoa beans, maybe like cocoa farms, or bananas or bricks or the fishing industry. Those are your primary culprits of labor trafficking industries. In the States, maybe we see it in farming sometimes. That might be a place in Michigan where we might see that occur. But in terms of the garment industry, it's actually it's the underlying ethic of the majority of the garment industry is to be exploitive. And so it's not necessarily that they're labor trafficking and that the people are actually enslaved by that industry. Because oftentimes these garment workers actually do earn money and they do have freedom to go back and forth to their home and to their family. But the nature of the industry and the exploitive nature of the industry is such that they don't, those things don't actually enhance their quality of life or provide any sort of dignified work or form of living for them. And so the exploitive nature of the industry as a whole aligns very much with what you would see in labor trafficking. But those differences are they actually do get paid some money, and then they have, some of their personal freedoms or freedoms such as is allowed by their government.
It seems like it's a way to hide like the mistreatment of a human being. They're getting paid a little bit, and they have freedoms, but they're really stuck and trapped in this really terrible situation. It doesn't add quality to their life, like you said. I think that's an important point to make.
Yeah, there is actually a whole movement of people that I've tried to wrap my head around that way of thinking. I've really tried to understand it, where people it's not a good thing to end fast fashion, that it actually would be compromising. But I've never been able to come into agreement with that, because if as just one person, I expect to be treated in a dignified manner and be paid a wage in accordance with the work that I'm producing, that I don't know a single American who doesn't expect that, then why is it okay that we justify and excuse that behavior not happening in other countries for products that we're buying? Because really what happens is big brands in wealthy nations exploit workers in impoverished nations so that people in those wealthy nations can buy those cheap products for a lot of money. Right. And so like just the whole concept of it, like, if we're really to apply ethics to how we live, it competes with that at every level. There's just like, I just don't see a real justification for the behavior.
And when you were saying that, it made me also think of the fact that the consumer, the person that's purchasing this product at a high cost, is not necessarily benefiting, other than they're getting a piece of garment. On the other end, the people that are being exploited are obviously not benefiting. Who's the benefiting person then? Who's the benefiting?
The brand.
Right. I mean, there isn't any. I mean, it's exploiting in order to gain profits for themselves, for this brand, for this entity that really isn't necessarily impacting the lives of anyone on either side, right?
Absolutely. And actually, if you're to line up brands, if you go back 7 years ago to when the factory collapsed, the Rana Plaza factory collapsed, there were multiple brand tags that were identified, but many more that weren't, that were producing their products in those factories. And so very often you can have in the exact same factory, you can have a very high-end $400 or $500 product being manufactured right next to a $25 product. And the brands are paying about the same amount of money for the actual manufacturing, but what you pay as a consumer because it has a brand label on it is, absurd. Right. And so, of course, who benefits from that? It's the brands. Yeah.
And you as the consumer are being exploited too then.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah. I mean, in the end, everyone else is we're all getting exploited when we decide to purchase.
Yeah. Because it's just a perceived value. It's not, there's not actually. Yeah. I think not to get too far off of the subject, but something that just popped into my head that I think is really important for consumers to know is the garment industry is actually one of the few industries that hasn't been automated. And a lot of times we hear words like handmade, and it makes us think that means that somebody was cared for and paid fairly because they handmade it. But every garment is actually still handmade. Even the ones made in the sweatshops, they're all still handmade. And so that's not really a differentiator, but it reaches a place in our hearts and it makes us think that it is. And so then we feel like we can feel good about it, but it's just perceived. It's really, there's not actually additional value attached to it. So there are a lot of stores that actually use that language as a way to portray a story that they want to tell, but you can't actually trace it back and see the value.
Well, okay. Well, speaking of that, what about the facade of the made in USA? I mean, they've created messaging. They can also create this like concept that this garment you're purchasing for whatever cost is made in the USA.
Yes. So the made in the USA laws, let's go back to the early 90s. It's really when this industry started to bloom and we started to see rapid production of fashion, an increase in the amount of seasons every year. And as a result of that, in order to keep up with it, brands had to sort of compromise, how they were doing things in order to not only produce the volume they needed to produce, but at a price point where their profit could increase as well. And so the public, we thought, it used to be that made in the USA like really happened here, and maybe you have 3 or 4 sweaters in your closet that actually are made in the USA. But with the advent of that global movement of developing garment industry around the globe, what happened is brands started taking advantage of the language of the law around what has to happen in order for made in the USA labels to be put on a product, or for a brand to claim that their products are made in the USA. And so what that ended up turning into is, because the law states only the last step of production has to occur in the United States in order for it to be called that, it literally means the tag on the garment can just be placed on the garment, and then you can say this garment was made in the United States. And so it is not uncommon in this industry that the entire thing will be outsourced around the world. Like, you might even make the right leg of a pant in Taiwan and the left leg in Cambodia, and then ship them back and forth overseas to another country to sew them together, and then ship them again to the United States to put the label in it, and you can call it made in the USA. And so that's just something that people really started manipulating, in the last 30 years or 40 years, where they can get that cheaper labor, but the law hasn't updated to, exclude people from being able to do that. And so brands say it's made in the USA all the time. The other part of that, not to exhaust this subject, but the other part of that is there are sweatshops in the USA. And LA and California have huge garment industries. And it is not uncommon that a brand will take a product to a factory and say, they might say, yep, this is where we're going to make it. And then it goes out the back door and down the street, and it's actually made in a sweatshop in that community. And you just are none the wiser. You have no idea. And so people oftentimes, even people who have products and they say made in the USA, don't even understand those rules. They don't even understand that law or how that industry manipulates it. So yeah, that's a whole nother thing. And that's where labor trafficking actually really does happen in this country. Historically, if you were to just Google, the last sweatshops that were broken up in LA or in New York, you will find that there's a lot of immigrant labor that's been brought into the States, and their papers are taken, their documents are taken, and they're put in these forced labor situations, and they have no recourse. They have no family, they have no funds, they have no papers. They're threatened with deportation. So they stay where they are because they have no options.
Wow. And these brands are using this,
Yes.
to profit from it. Within the US or outside.
Yeah. So it manipulates us as consumers because we feel like, I can feel good about this. It was made in the USA. But if you actually learn about it, it's horrifying and super disappointing. And yeah, it's, it's a whole nother arm to how to pursue truly ethically manufactured products. Yeah.
So I apologize. I've been in and out. So hopefully I might be a little lost, but have the two of you got into fast fashion and what is fast fashion, and
no.
Are we there yet, or
not yet? But it's perfect. We are.
I think we just teed that up. So
okay.
Yeah. Do you want me to go?
Okay. Tell us all about, so what is fast fashion? If there's like specific brands that we should be aware of, how does that affect the supply chains? Just tell us what you know about fast fashion, Emily.
Sure. Well, let's start fast fashion is the title that was given to the component of the already unethical garment industry. Okay, so we hear that word and we often associate that, like, you could probably think of many brands right now that are running through your head that you would attribute to fast fashion, right? The reality is that it doesn't operate any differently than the rest of the majority of the garment industry. Only about 0.5% of that industry does not exploit its makers.
Oh,
Okay. So for the global industry, 0.5, less than 1% is not exploiting its makers. So in that way, the same ethics that apply to fast fashion apply to 99.5% of the global garment industry. What separates fast fashion is that they've created 12 to 24 seasons a year, so that every 2 weeks, everything on their floor has a different color, a different pattern, a different style. And it's made so cheaply in such a way that not only when you go back a month later do you feel like everything you have is old and outdated and it's no longer trending. They do that very intentionally. But you also feel like, oh, I washed it twice and now it looks like junk. I can't wear it anymore. So I actually do need a new shirt. And so the mind game that it actually is playing on the consumer is you think you're spending less because you're buying cheaper pieces. They cost you less each time you go. But actually, since fast fashion became a thing, consumers on average are spending 500% more on garments than we ever did. And that's over the last, 30 years. So we actually are spending more. And we've been conditioned to believe I can't spend $100 on a sweater because I know I can go and get 2 sweaters for $80 at this store. But that sweater you're going to get, maybe a season out of, and then it's going to look like junk, or it's going to be super out of trend. And so then you're going to want new sweaters, right? And so where if you buy something that's made fairly, that has a more classical style to it, that can integrate into other pieces easily, you might get 8, 9, 10 years out of that garment, right? Okay, so just to differentiate, what is fast fashion as it relates to the rest of the garment industry? It's all the same. It's just that fast fashion puts out more seasons of wear. Okay. And so that's where fast fashion really gets attacked on the sustainability issue, because not only are they pouring dyes and chemicals into fresh water, but they're filling landfills with clothes that are worn, 4 or 5 times and then thrown away because there's something new and on trend that everybody wants to get. Any questions about that before I move on? It's a mouthful.
Yeah, I think you explained it very well.
Yeah. Okay. So then, in terms of the garment industry as a whole, including fast fashion, the biggest difference is just the unprotected standard of living for the people who work within it. Many, many governments around the globe have either aligned their minimum wage with the preference of the big brands that manufacture there, so that the brands can still pay cents for a garment. Or cents for a day's worth of work. And a lot of times the bigger the label is, the longer they've been doing this and the more volume they're producing, actually the more control they have over the factories. And so if the factory wants the job, then they have to adhere to whatever the expectations are of that brand. So if the brand says to them, we're going to pay you 3 cents for each item, and we want it on this date, and we want this many pieces. If the factory wants the work, they don't have negotiation. There's no other opportunity. So then the factory, if they decide okay, we're going to do it. If that's less than what the workers might be accustomed to making for a similar product like that, the workers still have to make that product, but now they're going to get paid less than what they were paid maybe with the previous brand because of the negotiations that happen that they have no control over. They can't advocate for themselves. And there's no other employment in these communities. And so it's not like here in the States where like you legitimately, as a United States citizen, could just go find another job. You could do that. And you have laws to protect you, and we have unions and things like that that can bring that kind of protection. But in these countries, those things don't exist. So there's no protection. The government is actually favoring the big brand, not their people. And then there's no other sources of employment. And you're living so below the poverty line and you're gone 20 to 23 hours a day. So like, when do you even begin to start trying to look for another option or even start your own business? Because you're so like held by this only option you have. And while it's a horrible option, it's all you have. So of course you don't walk away from your 2 cents a day because you have no other source of any employment. Right?
So Emily, what would it take? This is a little, what would it take for supply chains to actually be looked into and to become transparent and be held accountable and for laws be put in place? It seems like a really big job because there's so many moving pieces. I mean, it's such a big system.
Yeah.
And, some companies claim that they don't know, what's happening overseas, or they're not involved in that portion of the supply chain. So, I mean, what would it take to have people looking into all this and to change these kinds of things?
Yeah. I mean, well, first of all, you commented about, brands will often say like, we didn't know.
Yeah.
So there is plausible deniability, and they posture themselves very purposely with that because they know the American public, they know how the American people respond when a factory collapses, right? Because we're horrified by that. We get angry that it's going on. We get angry that we didn't know. We feel guilty. A lot of times we might even feel shame for the contribution that we've made towards like allowing those kinds of conditions. And so brands work really hard to hide that information from us. They don't want us to know about it. And so as a way to do that, they also have to shelter themselves. And so brands hire third-party vendors who do the factory negotiations for them. Wow. And so they are never dealing with the brand directly. So the brand actually has plausible deniability, but they fully know the nature of the industry, so there's no one in manufacturing who can claim ignorance to that. They do, but they really can't. They're lying. They're being deceptive when they do that because the industry as a whole is exploitive, and that's just common knowledge. So they separate themselves from those actual decisions. So they don't know that the third-party vendor who's been given a budget is negotiating with factories for the lowest price so that person can earn more, because that's going to end up affecting their pocket, right? And they don't really care what's happening on the other side of that, in the factory that accepts that job, the pregnant woman who's working can't take a bathroom break for 20 hours because she has a quota and she has to fill it, and her boss doesn't allow bathroom breaks during, those kinds of things. It allows the brands to separate themselves from the exploitive behavior. And so the first thing that would have to happen is there'd have to be accountability from the American government. The law around Made in the USA would need to change. Laws about importing would need to change. And we would need to work with established ethical organizations that have boots on the ground who can talk to what sort of expectations would need to be required in order for factory to demonstrate that, in order for us to receive those products into the United States and sell them to our people, right? That's my personal opinion. Like I feel like it's so deep And it's been allowed to go on for so long that we really can't trust the brands to start being ethical. As an example of that, you know, when Rana Plaza crashed in 2013, some of the main brands whose tags were identified, who, and remember, many of them denied, and then they were found out, right? And so then, you know, they went through that process of, oh, okay, I guess we did have, you know, some products in there. Well, there were many, many brands, probably hundreds of brands that we don't even know about that were manufacturing there. When that happened, there was an accord, if you will, that was established where these brands committed that they were going to start becoming more ethical in how they managed their manufacturing. Well, now fast forward to 2020 and we have COVID. And many of those same brands whose products were being made in that factory in Bangladesh, not all of them, but many of them, when the crisis came, they actually said to the factories that they had already contracted with, had already set expectations and a price that they would pay when the completed products were delivered, which would have fallen during that crisis. They went back to those factories and said, we don't want it anymore. Don't ship it to us. We don't want it. And the factories have already invested. They've already worked their people. They've already done all that. And now the brand is saying, oh, no, we don't want it anymore. We're not going to pay for it. Don't ship it to us because we don't want to pay for it. And so all of these people who already are living below poverty levels that we don't see in the United States, beyond what we would ever see here, are now left with no income at all because the brand didn't pay. That kind of behavior is demonstrative of you've done nothing to improve your ethics since your factory collapsed 7 years ago. And if a brand was willing now in the middle of this crisis to say, like, we're not going to just honor our obligation, we'll figure out what to do with it, and we're going to pay you for the work that we hired you to do. Instead, billions of dollars were halted after they had already invested that time. Some of those brands paid dividends to their investors, right? Some of those brands have now found either a new supply chain or maybe through the same desperate supply chain have now brought products in, and they're running sales all of November to try and make up for what they lost during COVID. But they're totally hiding what they did to the people in their manufacturing for the last 8 months. And we're none the wiser because we're protected from the information because we would revolt if we knew it.
Crazy.
Yeah. And
well,
so
and there's nothing legal even. There's like nothing legal even that can be done right at this point.
Correct.
I mean, there's so many layers and so many steps that it's like, well, they can get away with it. So they're going to continue to behave that way.
Yeah. And so that's why, like, we definitely need import laws. We definitely need, you know, how to deal with the US based sweatshop. I think that goes really deep. There's a lot of things there. And as a culture, we need to not only acknowledge that happens, but we need to be willing to deal with the bad information in order to, like, get to a good solution, right? And I think, you know, in my experience, that's very often what I think that's where people really struggle. Like, it's almost the dividing line of, I'm going to decide to not only hear what you just told me, but I'm going to respond to it in terms of how I live my life. It can be real, like we were saying before, like, it can be really shame producing to hear that. And it's hard to then decide, I'm going to, like, take a look at this and do this differently. And so I think as a culture, it'd be really hard for us to say, how did we allow this to happen on our watch? How did we allow for this to happen and excuse it and justify it? And what are my own behaviors that contributed to it? But then, like, what have I taught my kids? What have I demonstrated to other people? How do we, it's a huge boat to turn around at this point. And it can be done, but it's a huge boat.
And we'll get into, tips and stuff for everyone for, what are those little changes that we can start making in our lives to start shopping more ethically. But so Emily, can you also tell us about, there are some systems in place. What is fair trade and how does that make any difference, if it makes any difference?
Yeah. So fair trade, as the general public knows it, is an actual certification by the Fair Trade Organization that demonstrates that a artisan group or a factory has accomplished strong, accountable ethics in how they manufacture, that the work is dignified, that the wages are dignified, that there's intentionality at deep, deep levels in terms of the ongoings of that artisan group or of that factory. Fair trade, as people in the industry might refer to it, though, is actually just the ethics. It's not necessarily a certification, but for instance, I have 4 or 5 brands that are actually fair trade certified, but all of my brands exercise fair trade ethics. And so there's a transparency that has to be attached to that, where you can get on the website of the brand and you can actually see their artisans and read their bios and learn about how their employment has changed their life. Or you can get on and you can see, like, what does a factory look like? When was it last assessed? What is your lowest wage for your workers? And that's transparency in the industry, that it lines up with the fair trade certification, but there's smaller organizations that can be cost prohibitive to enter into actually fair trade certification. It costs them a fair amount of money to be able to do that. So if you're a small ethical brand and you only have 5 employees, but you want to keep those 5 employees working and you want to grow your business, the last thing you want to do is invest in an actual certification, because you're so small and you're just getting that momentum, right? But it doesn't mean that your ethics are any less than what would be under a certification. Does that make sense?
Okay.
So for me, I look for the transparency. I think for the general consumer, if you have a favorite brand, go to their website. Just look up their website and see how they celebrate the makers that make their products, because it's so rare. Again, it's only 0.5% of the industry. The people who do it, the reason they exist is to create opportunity where there is no opportunity. And so they're going to tell you all about it. They're going to celebrate it. You're going to hear stories. You're going to see all sorts of things about it that are going to make you feel good, and it's going to be legitimate. And they're going to use supportive information and language so that you can feel confident. So that's the first place to start. But yeah, I know we're going to get to tips later. I don't want to go I don't want to go too far into that, but that's I'm sorry I totally forgot your original question now. Did I answer it?
Well, you had mentioned that there was a difference between fair trade and fair trade.
Yeah. Does that did my answer clarify that?
Yeah, I think so. Hannah, do you have any?
Yeah, that was really good, because it's like, okay, that is a tip in and of itself for people who want to change the way they direct their buying power now, or are challenged to switch, so that the demand will be decreased to some of these brands, because people are now learning, okay, I should look for fair trade. I should look for, products that will show and prove an ethical standard. And that it can't just use this messaging or this language to exploit me anymore as a customer, right? Or as somebody who's looking for a particular product. It's as simple as, okay, why don't I look for what kind of fair trade products are out there? And I think it's a really good, I think you explained it really well, because it doesn't have to necessarily be certified or have a certificate. It's, are they actually ethical, and are they saying that they are, and it's consistent with their behavior, their actions.
And that even takes me to the
helpful.
idea of defining what that means for you as an individual. When you decide that you want to buy ethical products, how do you define ethical? Because the industry defines it very differently. And even like the language that brands will use to try and persuade you that they're exercising ethics in their manufacturing. I can share just a personal story, something I learned the hard way when I first opened the store. I had a brand that on the website, they said we prefer ethical factories. And then they had this beautiful story of a give back and how they started their business. And it was very romantic and very persuasive. I called the rep and said, tell me more about the manufacturing. And she assured me all these factories are monitored and these are the countries where they do it. And this is how often they're monitored. And I was still fairly naive, but I was persuaded. And so I purchased product from the brand. And when I got this first round of product, everything was fine. But then I had a customer call me and say, hey, I bought the sweater from you and the arms are huge on it. They're like 2 times bigger than the body of the sweater. And my heart sank because that's like classic error in sweatshop labor, is that, the arms don't fit right, or like things are missized or whatever, because again, they make the arms in one country and ship them to another to make the body, and things get all mixed up and right. So she sent it back to me and I reached back out to the brand and I said, hey, these are the things you told me. I told you this about my business and you assured me, and now I get this piece and it's clearly questionable. I need to understand, where was this piece made? And she said, well, we prefer ethical factories, but we had to private label some products because we were growing so fast. And so our factories couldn't accommodate them. And so we did use some other factories. And I'm like, oh, that's what you mean by prefer. You mean that you're willing to not use ethical factories, but when you can, you like to, but you could choose not to and not tell your people at any time, right? And so even learning that, I had to say, wow, you're really manipulating your customers because they think they're doing this great thing and you have this great give back story. And so everybody feels really good and warm and fuzzy, but you totally exploited the people who made your stuff, and your customers have no idea because you have such a great story. So as individuals, we have to decide, what does that mean to me? What kind of integrity do I expect out of the brands? Where will I compromise and where will I not compromise? And then find resources that match how you feel about it. And that's why I started the store, because that's a lot of work. I've been researching ethical brands for 6 years. I still do. I've been open for 4 years and I still am constantly checking the ones I have and finding new ones. It's a lot of work that most consumers are not interested in doing. And so what I love is to be a place where people can come and you can learn about brands. Maybe you don't buy from me, but maybe you come and you learn about brands and you go and research them on your own or whatever. I mean, obviously I'd love your business, but I want you also, to be able to learn about it so you can start, like, it can become real for you. So.
Yeah, Emily, tell us more about Adored Boutique and just the amazing things that you do there.
I would love to. Thank you. Yeah. So I knew nothing about ethical fashion. I was a nurse by degree. I was 19 years into my career. I hated what I was doing and really wanted something that I felt like I could make a difference. And like, I know people often think like, wow, nursing, you'd think you'd feel like you were making a difference, but I really did not. And so I just started learning about human trafficking, and it really broke my heart because I realized, wow, like all the ways I could have been making a difference, but I had no idea I needed to be making a difference. And so the more I learned, the more I was committed to be part of the solution. And so I quit my job and somehow managed to open a store in December of 2016. And I've learned a ton, but like I was saying, it really has become for me, I will not carry a brand that exists for any reason other than to create opportunity where there is none. Because that's the heart of what this really is I have many brands who employ people who have left sweatshops because they've established in a community where there is no other employment, but yet they're able to hire, 9, 10, 11, 12 people from the sweatshop and teach them a new trade. And then I have others that are just getting started, and some that are trailblazers. One of my brands is People Tree, and they're the fashion revolution people. They've been at this a long time, and they know it inside and out, and they're really good at what they do. And so I kind of all over the board in terms of the kind of brands that I offer, and then even style, because when we're talking, fair fashion, it's not always about what's the hottest trend, but it's about what's your personal style. And how do we help you build your personal style with clothes that matter and clothes that make a difference, that you can feel really good about wearing every day and not feel like you have to replace them every, couple months, but that you don't need to replace every couple months because they're so well made. So that's it in a nutshell.
Awesome. So is that considered slow fashion when it's?
Yeah. I mean, it's the polar opposite of fast fashion, right? It's not every 2 weeks a new season. It's, taking time and being intentional. Yeah. And being thoughtful about what's going into the product itself. And some of my brands have the people who make the product sign a tag on the inside of it. And it's amazing because there's something that happens with that in regards to like understanding the slow fashion movement. Like you would actually take time to make that tag, have someone sew it in, and have somebody sign it. And that alone just demonstrates like the care that they're putting into their people and to their product. So yeah, it's that kind of thing that really is what separates the larger garment industry from the movement of slow fashion.
That's amazing.
And we get to then, as the consumer, know that we're not being exploited and that we're not being taken advantage of and fooled, and that we're actually purchasing something that enhances a community, that
somebody's quality of life,
the right thing.
Yeah. It's so good.
That's awesome. Well, Emily, are there any other tips that you want to share with our audience? Just some quick, easy steps on how to start incorporating those types of decisions into our everyday lives? Or I think we...
Yeah, thanks. So we talked about defining what ethical means to you. Take a little bit of time to identify brands that have a DNA that reflect your personal style. So you can have like core brands that you always go to, core websites or core stores that sell ethical fashion. That can be like, okay, I need a black cardigan. I'm going to go here first, right? Another great option is thrifting. And there's actually a lot of reports that, thrifting is going to increase very significantly in the next 5 to 10 years in terms of the demand, but also the access to it. There's online thrifting. There's so many ways you can do it. It is a great option. If you can't find what you need new and ethical, or you can't necessarily afford what you need new and ethical, and you can find it thrifting, you're not supporting the brand. That money has already been going to the brand. By thrifting, you're supporting probably a small business, right? And then you're also sustainable in that way because you're preventing a garment that might otherwise just get thrown away from getting to thrown away. So that's another great option that a lot of people just don't think about in Grand Rapids. We have a ton of thrift stores, West Michigan as a whole. I mean, I think they're all over, right? There's some really great options. There, part of it is even mindset. So like I was talking about, I have some things that are $30 in my store, and I have some things that are $150 in my store. And we're very accustomed, because we've been told to think this way, that we shouldn't pay $150 for a sweater. And so sometimes we look at price tags of things, and the perceived value it's just not there, because we're not thinking the process. And so while fair trade used to be cost prohibitive, it's really not anymore. There's really good work that's happened to make it more affordable and more accessible for people. But you will find things that are more expensive because of the amount of labor that's required to make a hand knit cardigan, right? And so just kind of start wrapping your thinking around, okay, I might only get 2 new sweaters instead of 5. I'm going to pay a little bit more for them. They're going to last me longer and look nicer longer. But, am I willing to sort of do that in order to not contribute to the other industry? And then the last one that I would say is, as a culture, if we decide to put pressure on the brands that are not demonstrating ethics in their manufacturing, we can actually change that industry. They'll have 2 choices. They'll either have to shut it down, or they'll have to change. And it's about 1% of the average major brand's marketing budget that they would have to pay in order to increase the salaries of their garment workers so that they're making a living wage. And that's it. And so if we put pressure on them, they're not going to, throw their hands up and say, we're going to go bankrupt and we're not going to close all the malls in the United States, which is a fear tactic that's used a lot. It actually, the more we do it and the more we hold them accountable and the less we're willing to spend our money with them, the more likely they are to actually change the way they're operating and take care of their people. And so if we can be courageous to start doing that where we can, then it actually can influence that industry and we can change it.
So using our demand for good, there's a demand, currently there's a demand for cheap goods. But if we start curbing that demand and start demanding transparency and ethical standards, we can use our demand for good.
There's an initiative called Who Made My Clothes. It's a hashtag, Who Made My Clothes. And if you follow it, you'll see a lot of influencers in this arena who will use that, and they'll encourage you, ask when you go in the store in the mall, ask who made these clothes, where were they made? Email the brands, who made my clothes, tag them in your post, who made my clothes. So there's a movement already started. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We just got to jump on.
Yeah, I was going to say one of the real simple things too is just post stuff on your social media. When you find something, post it, share it, start talking to your own community, your friends, your influencers, the place that you work, and just start spreading the news. It's the same thing with just human trafficking education in and of itself. It's just about going out there and being a voice piece as well, and helping to spread the news and helping to educate the community and shed light on it.
Yeah, absolutely. The more we can talk about it, the more we can see what's actually going on in the background, and then the more we'll feel empowered to do something about it. Agree fully.
Something we all play a part in, for sure. Well, thank you so much, Emily. I've certainly learned a lot. This has been very eye-opening. You are such an inspiring person. It was just so great to talk with you, learn from you. I hope to stay in touch if we can, continue to support Ward Boutique in any way. But it has just been such a pleasure. If there are any questions from the audience, we give you a couple minutes. We are gonna sign off, and start to close up, but I wanted to give the audience an opportunity.
And while you're maybe thinking of some questions, know that there's resources and extra links to different websites that go ahead and look. I think they've been put in the comments, and links in the comments of Facebook and YouTube. So go through there, check those out, just for more information and some resources for you guys. And we're just so grateful for you, Emily S. Like you had said, Emily, we hope that again that this provides information for you guys and hope. Right? Because we're all about cup of hope. The goal is to present hope and tangible steps that you can take in your personal lives to help make a difference and to impact other people's lives in a positive way. And so in that line of thinking, don't forget to share a cup of hope with someone today. And thank you so much for tuning in.
I love that. Thank you for having me. It was such an honor. It was such a joy to meet both of you. I appreciate it.
Yes.
So thank you, ladies, and thank you everyone for attending today's Cup of Hope panel. We appreciate your time and I hope you found it valuable. If you are interested in learning more, there were resources put into the chat, so you're welcome to go ahead and click on any of those links, and of course visit adoredboutique.com online. You can shop online, not just in Grand Rapids, for those of you guys on the east side over here. And then also the Michigan Abolitionist Project has their fundraiser this Sunday, November 8th at 6 p.m. And you're welcome to tune in. It will be live streamed at mapforfreedom.org. So be sure to tune in. It's a fun Latin themed evening with Matt Boyd and sharing a vision for the new year. And then finally, be sure to tune in on next month on December 2nd, when we're going to discuss the role of men in the fight against human trafficking. On behalf of Hope Against Trafficking and the Michigan Abolitionist Project, thank you so much for joining us today.